Before we step into tonight's story, I, Julian Cross, need a moment with you. This is a new chapter for the Midnight File, and you're here at the very beginning of something we're building together. A community of people who don't flinch from the dark, who understand that the most unsettling stories are often the ones that matter most. We're pushing toward our first 100 subscribers, and if you're hearing my voice right now, you're already part of the foundation of this channel. So I'm asking you, hit that subscribe button, drop a like. Let's see if we can reach 50 likes on this video. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories travel. How many midnight listeners are out there in the dark with me? What you're about to hear is true. Every word. This isn't fiction, it isn't rumor, it isn't some campfire tale whispered into the smoke. This happened. And because it happened, and because the details cross into territory too disturbing for this platform, I'll be omitting a few specifics, but don't be misled. What I leave unsaid, your imagination will carve into place. And sometimes, that's far worse. There are moments in history when the world fractures, when humanity stands at the edge of an abyss so dark, so incomprehensible, that even decades later, we struggle to understand how we arrived there. This is the story of one man who orchestrated the greatest crime in human history. This is the story of Adolf Hitler, and the systematic elimination of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others deemed undesirable by a regime built on hatred, propaganda, and industrial-scale violence. This is a true story. Every fact you will hear has been documented, verified, and stands as testimony to what human beings are capable of when ideology, bureaucracy, and absolute power converge. We begin not with the camps, not with the trains, not with the final moments, but with a failed artist in Vienna, living in homeless shelters, selling watercolor postcards to survive. Because to understand the Holocaust, we must first understand the man who conceived it, the making of a dictator. Vienna, 1907. A young man stands before the entrance of the Academy of Fine Arts, clutching a portfolio of drawings. He has traveled from the provinces with dreams of becoming a professional artist, of making his mark on the world through painting and architecture. His name is Adolf Hitler, and he is 18 years old. The rejection letter arrives with cold efficiency. His anatomical drawings are inadequate. His technique is lacking. The Academy suggests he pursue architecture instead, a practical redirection for someone whose artistic vision exceeds his technical skill. But Hitler does not take the advice. He does not enroll in technical school. He does not return home to reconsider his path. Instead, he disappears into Vienna's underbelly. For the next several years, he lives in homeless shelters and men's dormitories, subsisting on charity soup and the occasional sale of postcards he paints of the city's landmarks. He applies to the Academy again in 1908. He is rejected again. What happens in the mind of a man who experiences repeated rejection? What psychological seed is planted when institutions tell you that you are not good enough, not talented enough, not worthy? For most people, rejection becomes a moment of recalibration, a chance to adapt, to find a new path, to accept limitations and build from there. For Hitler, rejection became something else entirely. It became evidence of conspiracy. In his later writings, particularly in Mein Kampf, published in 1925, he describes his artistic failures with a peculiar vagueness. He blames unnamed schoolmasters and hints at forces working against him. He never acknowledges his own lack of skill. He never accepts that perhaps the Academy's assessment was accurate. This pattern, this inability to accept personal responsibility, this tendency to externalize blame onto hidden enemies, would become the psychological architecture of everything that followed. Historians who have studied Hitler's early years identify this period as formative. The poverty, the humiliation, the sense of being rejected by the very culture he admired, these experiences crystallized into a worldview built on grievance. He began to see himself not as a failed artist, but as a prophet unrecognized by a corrupt system, and he began to identify scapegoats for that corruption. In Vienna's streets, Hitler encountered the political pamphlets and speeches of pan-Germanic nationalism and anti-Semitism. These ideas were not new. Anti-Jewish sentiment had existed in Europe for centuries, rooted in religious prejudice, economic resentment, and cultural xenophobia. But in early 20th century Vienna, these ideas were being synthesized into a modern political ideology. Jews were characterized not merely as a religious minority, but as a racial threat, a biological contaminant poisoning European civilization. For a young man looking for answers to his own failures, this ideology offered something seductive. It offered an enemy. It offered a narrative in which his poverty, his rejection, his invisibility were not his fault. They were the result of a vast conspiracy orchestrated by Jews, communists, and internationalists who sought to destroy everything pure and noble in German culture. Hitler absorbed these ideas like a man dying of thirst. They gave him purpose, they gave him clarity, and they gave him someone to hate. In 1913, seeking to avoid military service in the Austro-Hungarian army, Hitler moved to Munich. When World War I erupted in 1914, he volunteered for the Bavarian army, serving as a dispatch runner, a dangerous role that involved carrying messages between command posts and frontline positions. He was, by most accounts, a competent soldier. He received the Iron Cross Second Class in 1914 and the Iron Cross First Class in 1918, an unusual honor for someone of his rank. Near the war's end, Hitler was temporarily blinded by a British mustard gas attack near Ypres. He spent weeks recovering in a military hospital. During this time, Germany surrendered. The war was over. Germany had lost. For Hitler, this was not merely a military defeat. It was a betrayal. He became convinced, as did many Germans, that the army had not been defeated on the battlefield, but had been stabbed in the back by politicians, socialists, and Jews on the home front. This conspiracy theory, known as the Dolchstoßlegende or stab-in-the-back myth, became central to Hitler's political ideology. Germany had not failed. Germany had been betrayed. In the chaos of post-war Germany, a nation humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, crushed by war reparations, and spiraling into economic collapse, Hitler found his calling. He joined a small political group called the German Workers' Party. Within months, he had transformed it into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. And he discovered something remarkable. He could speak. Not in the measured intellectual tones of traditional politicians, but with raw emotional intensity. He could make audiences feel their humiliation, their rage, their desire for revenge. He could transform abstract resentment into focused hatred. And he could offer them redemption through violence, the weaponization of propaganda. By 1933, Hitler had maneuvered himself into the position of Chancellor of Germany. What followed was not merely a political administration, but a total reconstruction of reality itself. Under the direction of Joseph Goebbels, appointed as Reich Minister of Propaganda, the Nazi regime built one of history's most sophisticated systems for mass psychological manipulation. Every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every film, every school curriculum, every piece of art, everything the German public saw, heard, or read was centralized under state control. The principles of Nazi propaganda were simple, and Hitler outlined them explicitly. First, appeal to emotion, never to reason. Rational argument invites debate. Emotional manipulation demands compliance. Second, repeat your message endlessly. A lie told once is just a lie. A lie told 1,000 times becomes truth. Third, identify a specific enemy and make that enemy responsible for every social problem. Abstract threats are forgettable. A personified enemy becomes a focus for rage. For the Nazi regime, that enemy was clear: Jews and communists. These groups were portrayed not as fellow citizens with different beliefs, but as existential threats to German survival. They were characterized as parasites, as vermin, as a disease infecting the body of the nation. This language was not accidental. Dehumanization is a necessary precondition for violence. You cannot easily harm someone you recognize as fully human. But if you can convince yourself that they are something less than human, something dangerous, something contaminating, then violence becomes not just acceptable, but necessary. What's remarkable is how effective this propaganda was, even internationally. During the 1930s, before the full scope of Nazi atrocities became known, Hitler was portrayed in certain British and American publications as a respectable statesman. Magazines ran photo essays showing Hitler at his mountain retreat, surrounded by art and classical architecture. They described him as a vegetarian, an animal lover, a man of culture and refinement. This carefully constructed image served a purpose. It made fascism seem civilized, even attractive. The regime understood something profound about human psychology. People want to believe that their leaders are normal, reasonable, even admirable. If you can present your dictator as a cultured gentleman who loves his dog, then perhaps his politics aren't so extreme after all. Perhaps the rumors of persecution are exaggerated. Perhaps everything will be fine. This was propaganda operating at its most insidious level, not through obvious lies, but through carefully curated truths that concealed the larger reality. Within Germany itself, the propaganda targeted children with particular intensity. The Hitler Youth became compulsory for young Germans. Children were taught to idolize the Führer, to report even their parents if they expressed doubts about the regime, to see themselves as soldiers in a racial struggle for survival. Education was restructured around Nazi ideology. Biology classes taught racial pseudoscience. History classes taught German victimhood and the need for Lebensraum, living space, to be seized from inferior peoples in the East. An entire generation grew up knowing nothing but Nazi ideology. They knew no alternative narratives. They had no framework for questioning what they were told. And when the time came to participate in atrocity, many did so without apparent moral conflict, because they had been taught since childhood that what they were doing was necessary, even noble. This is how propaganda works. Not through obvious coercion, but through the slow, systematic reconstruction of moral reality. When you control all sources of information, when you shape consciousness from childhood, when you offer simple answers to complex problems and direct all rage toward a designated enemy, you can make ordinary people complicit in extraordinary evil. The bureaucracy of elimination. What distinguishes the Holocaust from other atrocities in history is not merely its scale, though the scale is incomprehensible. What distinguishes it is its systematic, bureaucratic character. This was not a spontaneous outbreak of violence. This was not a pogrom driven by mob rage. This was industrial-scale elimination, planned in conference rooms, documented in official memoranda, and executed with the efficiency of a modern corporation. On January 20th, 1942, 15 senior officials from various Nazi ministries gathered at a villa on the shore of Wannsee Lake, near Berlin. The meeting was chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Reich Security Main Office, and the minutes were compiled by Adolf Eichmann, who would later be described as the architect of the logistics of the final solution. The purpose of this 90-minute meeting was to coordinate the systematic elimination of all Jews within Nazi-occupied Europe. The language used in the official protocol is telling. The document speaks of evacuation to the east and natural diminution through labor. These were euphemisms. What they meant was transportation to camps where people would be worked to exhaustion or taken directly to chambers designed for mass execution. The Wannsee Protocol, one of the most crucial surviving Nazi documents, reveals the chilling banality of genocide as an administrative problem. The officials discussed transportation schedules, jurisdictional questions about who would be responsible for Jews in various occupied territories, and logistical challenges in processing millions of people. They debated whether certain categories of Jews, those married to non-Jews, or those who had fought in World War I, should be exempted or merely deferred in the elimination process. There was no dramatic rhetoric in this document. No impassioned speeches about racial purity, just bureaucrats solving logistical problems. This is what Hannah Arendt would later call the banality of evil, the recognition that monstrous crimes can be committed by ordinary people doing paperwork, organizing train schedules and filing reports. When violence is mediated through layers of bureaucracy, when it becomes a matter of memos and requisition forms rather than face-to-face confrontation, people can participate in atrocity while psychologically distancing themselves from its reality. The death camps themselves reflected this industrial efficiency. Between 1941 and 1945, the Nazi regime constructed 6 main extermination facilities in occupied Poland and Soviet territories: Chełmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, and Auschwitz-Birkenau. These were not concentration camps in the traditional sense, places where people were imprisoned and forced to labor. These were facilities designed for one purpose: the rapid elimination of human life. Treblinka operated for just 15 months, from July 1942 to October 1943. In that brief window between 700 and 900, some people, overwhelmingly Jews, were taken there and eliminated. The process was designed for efficiency. Victims arrived in cattle cars, were ordered to disembark, told they were entering a transit camp, instructed to undress for showers, and directed into chambers where they were overcome by carbon monoxide gas from tank engines. The entire process, from arrival to completion, could take as little as 2 hours. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest of the camps, approximately 1 million people lost their lives. The facility used Zyklon B, hydrogen cyanide in pellet form, which had been developed as a pesticide but was repurposed for mass extermination. The camp complex combined forced labor with immediate elimination. Upon arrival, SS doctors conducted selections, cursory examinations lasting seconds, in which a glance and a gesture determined whether someone would be sent to forced labor or taken directly to the gas chambers. Children, the elderly, and anyone deemed unfit for work were typically sent immediately to elimination. The total number of victims in the Holocaust is approximately 6 million Jews. This number is derived from multiple sources: Nazi documentation that survived the war, demographic analysis comparing pre-war and post-war Jewish populations, testimony from survivors and perpetrators, and forensic evidence from the camps themselves. Of these 6 million, approximately 7 million were taken to the 6 main extermination facilities. Another 2 million were eliminated in mass shooting operations carried out by mobile units known as Einsatzgruppen, which followed the German army into occupied Soviet territories and systematically executed Jewish communities. Between 800,000 and 1 million perished in ghettos, labor camps, and concentration camps through starvation, disease, brutality, and execution. These are not abstract numbers. Each one represents a person, someone with a name, a family, dreams, fears, a life interrupted and ended by a regime that declared them unworthy of existence. The psychology of perpetrators. One of the most disturbing questions the Holocaust raises is this: how did ordinary people become participants in mass violence? The answer, as uncomfortable as it is, suggests that under the right conditions, most people are capable of complicity in atrocity. Historian Christopher Browning conducted extensive research on Reserve Police Battalion 101, a unit of approximately 500 middle-aged men, too old for frontline military service, who were drafted into police duties in occupied Poland. These were not ideological fanatics. They were not SS true believers. They were shopkeepers, clerks, teachers, and laborers, ordinary men from Hamburg. Between 1942 and 1943, this unit participated in the forced removal and execution of tens of thousands of Jews in occupied Poland. Browning's research, based on post-war testimony and interrogations, revealed a pattern that challenges our comfortable assumptions about human nature. When the unit was first ordered to participate in mass shootings, the commanding officer, Major Wilhelm Trapp, gave the men an option. He told them that the task ahead was unpleasant but necessary. He said that any man who did not feel capable of carrying out the order could step aside without punishment. Out of approximately 500 men, fewer than a dozen stepped forward. Why? Browning identified several psychological and social factors. First, deference to authority. The men recognized the legitimacy of the command structure. When a superior officer says something must be done, the default human response is compliance. Second, conformity. When surrounded by peers who are accepting orders, or at least not openly refusing, the social cost of dissent feels overwhelming. To refuse is to mark yourself as different, as weak, as disloyal. Third, diffusion of responsibility. When violence is carried out collectively, no individual feels entirely responsible. Everyone is just following orders. Everyone is just doing their part. And finally, habituation. What was initially traumatic became, through repetition, routine. Men who were physically ill after their first shooting operation described how after the 10th or 20th time, they no longer felt anything. The horror receded. The act became mechanical. This is perhaps the most disturbing finding, that human beings possess an extraordinary capacity to adapt to atrocity. What should remain unthinkable can, through repeated exposure, become normal. Psychologist Stanley Milgram's famous obedience experiments, conducted in the 1960s, demonstrated this principle in controlled conditions. Milgram asked ordinary Americans to administer what they believed were painful, potentially lethal electric shocks to innocent strangers, simply because an authority figure in a white coat told them to continue. The majority complied, even when they could hear the victim, actually an actor, screaming in apparent agony. Milgram's conclusion was that most people, when placed in a hierarchical structure and given orders by an authority figure, will suspend their own moral judgment and comply. He called this the agentic state, a psychological condition in which people cease to see themselves as autonomous moral agents and instead view themselves as instruments executing another's will. This research doesn't excuse the perpetrators of the Holocaust, but it does suggest something deeply uncomfortable, that the capacity for this kind of evil is not confined to uniquely monstrous individuals or uniquely evil cultures. It exists as a potential in most human beings, waiting to be activated by the right combination of authority, ideology, social pressure, and moral disengagement. The mind of the dictator. While social and institutional factors explain how genocide became possible, we cannot ignore the psychology of Hitler himself, the man who initiated and directed the entire apparatus of extermination. No formal psychiatric diagnosis was ever made during Hitler's lifetime, but post-war psychological analyses, based on his documented behavior, his writings and testimony from those who knew him, reveal a pattern consistent with severe personality pathology. Psychologists who have studied Hitler's case identify multiple overlapping traits: paranoid personality features, an excessive suspicion of others' motives, a belief in hidden conspiracies, a tendency to perceive hostility even where none exists. Narcissistic traits, a grandiose sense of self-importance, a belief in his own historical destiny, an inability to tolerate criticism or acknowledge failure. Antisocial or sociopathic characteristics, a profound lack of empathy for others, a willingness to cause harm without remorse, a view of other people as instruments to be used or obstacles to be eliminated. And sadistic tendencies. Evidence suggests Hitler derived satisfaction from others' suffering. Some analysts have also noted schizotypal features, magical thinking disconnected from empirical reality. Hitler's beliefs about racial purity, about Jewish conspiracies, about his own messianic role in history, these were not rational assessments of reality. They were delusions he held with absolute conviction. Psychoanalytic approaches to understanding Hitler suggest that his rigid psychological defenses, his inability to acknowledge personal failure or accept responsibility, reflected deep narcissistic wounds from his early rejections. In this interpretation, the external enemies he constructed, Jews, communists, liberal democracy, represented his internalized enemies, his own sense of inadequacy, his own failures, his own weakness. By projecting these unacceptable parts of himself onto an external enemy and then eliminating that enemy, he could symbolically destroy the parts of himself he couldn't bear to acknowledge. What makes Hitler particularly dangerous, from a psychological perspective, is that his pathology was not incapacitating. He was not so psychologically disturbed that he couldn't function. On the contrary, he was highly functional, politically cunning, and capable of extraordinary strategic manipulation. He understood human psychology intuitively and weaponized it. His emotional instability and paranoia were not weaknesses that undermined his power. They were features that enabled him to make decisions that a psychologically healthier person would reject as unconscionable. He could order the elimination of millions of people with the same detached efficiency that another person might reorganize a filing system. And he did so while believing, with absolute certainty, that he was saving civilization. The final days by April 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. Soviet forces were advancing through Eastern Europe. American and British forces had crossed the Rhine. The Allied armies were converging on Berlin from multiple directions. The regime that had promised to last 1,000 years was ending after just 12. Hitler had retreated to the Führerbunker, a concrete structure buried 50 feet beneath the Reich Chancellery in central Berlin. As the Soviet artillery drew closer, as the sounds of battle echoed through the streets above, Hitler faced the reality he had spent years refusing to acknowledge. He had lost. On April 29, 1945, Hitler married Eva Braun, his longtime companion. They had been together for years, but he had kept the relationship largely hidden, believing that his image as a leader required him to appear devoted solely to Germany. Now, with everything collapsing, the facade no longer mattered. The next day, April 30th, as Soviet forces fought street by street through Berlin, Hitler dictated his final testament. Even in this last document, he accepted no responsibility. He blamed the war on international Jewry. He claimed he had wanted peace but had been forced into conflict. He appointed Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor and urged the German people to continue fighting. Then, in the early afternoon, Hitler and Eva Braun withdrew to his private quarters. What happened next is documented through the testimony of multiple witnesses who were present in the bunker. Otto Günsche, Hitler's personal adjutant, and Heinz Linger, his valet, both reported hearing a single gunshot. When they entered the room moments later, they found Hitler and Braun both deceased. Hitler had ended his own life with a gunshot to the head. Braun had taken cyanide. In accordance with Hitler's prior instructions, he had expressed fear that his body would be captured and displayed by the Soviets. The bodies were carried to the Reich Chancellery garden. Hitler's chauffeur, Erich Kempka, had procured approximately 200 liters of petrol. The bodies were placed in a shallow crater, created by Soviet artillery, doused with fuel, and set alight. However, the cremation was incomplete. Soviet artillery continued to shell the area, making it impossible to tend the fire properly. The partially burned remains were buried in a shallow grave. Soviet forces captured the Reich Chancellery the following day, May 1st. They discovered the burial site and exhumed the remains. For years, the Soviet government publicly claimed uncertainty about Hitler's fate, partly for propaganda purposes, suggesting he might have escaped and was being sheltered by Western powers. In reality, Soviet intelligence had secured forensic evidence. The most definitive proof came from dental remains. Hitler's dentist, Dr. Hugo Blaschke, had kept detailed records, including X-rays and descriptions of extensive dental work. A dental technician, Käthe Häusermann, who had assisted in Hitler's treatment, was captured and interrogated by Soviet authorities. She was able to identify the dental remains with precision. In 2017, French pathologists Philippe Charlier and Philippe Ransard were granted access by Russia's FSB to examine the physical remains retained by Soviet authorities, specifically fragments of Hitler's jaw and teeth. Their forensic analysis, published in the European Journal of Internal Medicine, concluded definitively that the remains matched Hitler's dental records. The research confirmed that he had taken his own life in Berlin in April 1945. Analysis of deposits on the teeth suggested exposure to cyanide, and a skull fragment showed damage consistent with a gunshot. In 1956, after extensive investigation, a German court formally declared Hitler deceased, with the date of death confirmed as April 30th, 1945. The persistent myth of escape. Despite overwhelming forensic evidence, a conspiracy theory has persisted for decades. The claim that Hitler escaped to South America, most commonly to Argentina, where he allegedly lived in hiding for years. This theory emerged almost immediately after the war's end. The FBI under Director J. Edgar Hoover investigated numerous reports of Hitler sightings. Hoover took these claims seriously enough to authorize investigations. However, by September 1945, he concluded that there was no serious indication that Adolf Hitler is in Argentina. The FBI files contain dozens of reports, claims that Hitler was seen at a hotel in Brazil, that he was living on a remote ranch in Argentina, that submarines had transported him to safety. Historian Luke Daly Groves conducted extensive analysis of these FBI files and found that the sources of these rumors were diverse and often unreliable. Some came from attention seekers fabricating stories for publicity. Some came from political operatives attempting to embarrass rivals by suggesting they were harboring Nazis. Some came from individuals with apparent psychological disturbances. None produced credible evidence. 2 German submarines, U-530 and U-977, did surface in Argentina in mid-1945, which fueled speculation. However, both submarines were thoroughly searched by Argentine and Allied authorities. No high-ranking Nazi officials were found aboard. The submarines' logs and the testimony of their crews indicated they had fled to Argentina to avoid capture, not to transport fugitives. In 2025, Argentine President Javier Milei ordered the declassification of documents related to Nazi fugitives who had escaped to Argentina. These documents confirmed what historians had long known. Thousands of Nazi collaborators, war criminals and SS officers did indeed escape to South America through organized networks known as rat lines. These escape routes involved cooperation from sympathetic officials, funding from looted assets, and in some cases, assistance from elements within the Catholic Church who believed they were helping anti-communists escape persecution. The declassified documents provided new details about these escape networks, but they contained no credible evidence that Hitler himself had escaped. Claims in the documents referring to Hitler sightings were accompanied by explicit disclaimers from intelligence agencies, stating they could not verify the information. Former CIA officer Bob Baer, in promoting a television documentary series, suggested that the Argentine documents may challenge the official account of Hitler's death. However, fact-checkers and historians who examined the documents found that they contained second-hand hearsay and unverified claims, precisely the kind of unreliable intelligence that agencies routinely collect but cannot substantiate. The persistence of the escape narrative reveals something about human psychology. For some, the idea that Hitler died by his own hand in a bunker, defeated, humiliated, reduced to a corpse burned in a shell crater, is somehow unsatisfying. It's too mundane an ending for history's most notorious criminal. The escape narrative offers something more dramatically compelling. The villain who gets away, the hidden truth waiting to be discovered. The possibility that the story isn't really over. For neo-Nazi movements, the escape narrative serves a different function. It creates a mythologized Führer, who was never truly defeated, who remains somehow still present, still relevant. It's a form of denial, a refusal to accept the totality of the Nazi regime's failure. But the forensic evidence is unambiguous. Hitler died in Berlin on April 30th, 1945. His remains were identified through dental forensics that match his documented medical records with scientific certainty. The conspiracy theory persists not because the evidence supports it, but because some people find it psychologically preferable to historical reality. The banality of evil. In 1961, the Israeli security service Mossad captured Adolf Eichmann in Argentina, where he had been living under an assumed identity. Eichmann was the SS officer who had compiled the minutes of the Wannsee Conference and had coordinated the logistics of transporting millions of Jews to the extermination camps. He was brought to Israel to stand trial for crimes against humanity. Philosopher Hannah Arendt attended the trial as a journalist and wrote a series of articles that were later collected in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. What Arendt observed challenged expectations about what a mass perpetrator should look like. Eichmann was not a raging fanatic. He was not consumed by obvious hatred. He was, in Arendt's assessment, a bureaucrat. He described his role in the Holocaust in the language of administration. He had managed transportation schedules, coordinated with various agencies, solved logistical problems. He claimed he had simply been doing his job, following orders, advancing his career through diligent execution of assigned duties. Arendt introduced the concept of the banality of evil, the recognition that monstrous crimes can be committed by ordinary, even mediocre people who lack the imagination or moral courage to question what they're doing. Eichmann, she argued, was not exceptionally evil. He was exceptionally thoughtless. He participated in genocide not because he was driven by murderous ideology, but because he was ambitious, obedient, and unwilling to think critically about the moral implications of his actions. This insight was controversial and remains debated. Some argued that Arendt underestimated Eichmann's ideological commitment and his active role in pushing for more efficient methods of extermination. Trial testimony suggested Eichmann had been more enthusiastic about his role than he claimed, but Arendt's broader point remains profound. Modern bureaucratic structures allow people to participate in atrocity while maintaining psychological distance from the reality of what they're doing. When violence is mediated through paperwork, when it's broken down into discrete administrative tasks, when each person can say, "I was only responsible for transportation schedules," or "I only processed forms," then massive crimes can be committed by people who never personally confront the human consequences of their actions. This is what makes the Holocaust uniquely terrifying. It wasn't only the product of Hitler's individual pathology or German cultural uniqueness. It was a demonstration of how any modern bureaucratic state, staffed by ordinary people seeking career advancement and social acceptance, can become a machine for genocide if the political, psychological, and institutional conditions align. The Holocaust required thousands of perpetrators and millions of bystanders. It required railway workers to operate the trains. It required clerks to process the paperwork. It required factory workers to manufacture the equipment. It required bankers to manage the finances. It required ordinary citizens to look away, to convince themselves that what was happening wasn't their responsibility. And the vast majority of these people were not monsters. They were ordinary human beings who made choices, some actively participating, some simply failing to resist, that collectively enabled the greatest crime in human history. The unanswered questions. The Holocaust is solved in a forensic sense. The crime is documented with extraordinary thoroughness. The perpetrators have been identified. Hitler's responsibility is absolute and indisputable. His fate is confirmed through forensic evidence that meets the highest scientific standards. But the psychological questions, the questions about human nature itself, remain open. Given the right circumstances, how many people would behave as the perpetrators of the Holocaust did? What psychological vulnerabilities in human nature can be exploited by propaganda, authority, and ideology? How can societies recognize and resist the conditions that make genocide possible? Research in psychology and sociology since 1945 suggests uncomfortable answers. The Milgram experiments, the Stanford prison experiment, studies on conformity, obedience, and moral disengagement. All of this research points toward the same disturbing conclusion, that the capacity for complicity in atrocity is not confined to uniquely evil individuals or cultures. It exists as a latent potential in most human beings. We want to believe that we would be different, that if we had lived in Nazi Germany, we would have resisted, that we would have hidden Jews in our attics, sabotaged the regime, refused to participate no matter the cost. We want to believe that we possess moral courage that others lacked, but the evidence suggests that most people, placed in the same circumstances, would conform, would obey, would rationalize their participation or their silence, would prioritize their own safety and that of their families over abstract moral principles, would tell themselves that what they're doing isn't really that bad, or that they have no choice, or that someone else would do it anyway if they refused. This doesn't mean that resistance was impossible. There were Germans who resisted, some actively, at great personal risk. There were individuals who hid Jews, who sabotaged military production, who distributed anti-Nazi literature, who refused orders even when refusal meant imprisonment or execution. These people existed. Their courage was real. But they were a minority. Most people conformed, and the question we must confront is, which group would we have belonged to? The Holocaust challenges our fundamental assumptions about human nature. We want to believe that people are basically good, that evil requires exceptional circumstances or exceptional individuals, but the Holocaust suggests that under certain conditions, conditions that can be deliberately created through propaganda, ideology, bureaucratic structure, and social pressure, ordinary people can participate in extraordinary evil while maintaining their self-image as decent moral individuals. This is the lesson that remains relevant today. The specific circumstances of Nazi Germany won't repeat exactly, but the psychological and social mechanisms that made the Holocaust possible, the dehumanization of designated enemies, the suspension of critical thinking in the face of authority, the diffusion of responsibility through bureaucratic structure, the normalization of incremental cruelty, these mechanisms remain available. They can be activated again in different contexts by different ideologies against different victims. Recognizing this potential is not pessimism, it's realism, and it's necessary if we are to remain vigilant against the conditions that make genocide possible. The Holocaust was not an inexplicable aberration. It was the result of specific, identifiable conditions that transformed a modern society into a machine for systematic violence. Understanding those conditions, understanding how propaganda reshapes moral reality, how bureaucracy enables moral disengagement, how ordinary people become complicit in atrocity, is essential to preventing similar crimes in the future. Conclusion: Adolf Hitler orchestrated the systematic elimination of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others, Roma, disabled individuals, political dissidents, homosexuals, and countless others deemed unworthy by his regime. This crime is historically documented beyond dispute. The evidence, Nazi documents, survivor testimony, forensic analysis, demographic data, is overwhelming. Hitler himself died in Berlin on April 30, 1945, his body partially cremated in the Reich Chancellery Garden, his remains later identified through dental forensics. There is no mystery about his fate. The conspiracy theories that claim otherwise persist, not because evidence supports them, but because some find the reality unsatisfying or ideologically inconvenient. But the deeper questions, the psychological questions about human nature, remain unresolved. How does a society descend into genocide? How do ordinary people become perpetrators? What psychological mechanisms can be exploited to transform conformity into complicity in mass violence? The answers are disturbing because they suggest that the capacity for this kind of evil is not exceptional. It's latent in most human beings, waiting to be activated by the right combination of propaganda, authority, ideology, and social pressure. This is not a comfortable conclusion. We want to believe that the Holocaust was unique, that it required uniquely evil people or a uniquely evil culture, that it could never happen again. But that belief is itself dangerous, because when we tell ourselves that genocide is exceptional, that it requires special circumstances we can easily recognize and avoid, we blind ourselves to the ordinary, incremental processes through which societies normalize cruelty and rationalize violence. The lesson of the Holocaust is not just about what happened between 1933 and 1945. It's about what human beings are capable of under certain conditions. It's about the fragility of civilization, the ease with which moral norms can be suspended, the speed with which neighbors can become enemies. And it's about the responsibility each of us bears to remain vigilant, not just against overt evil, but against the gradual normalization of dehumanization, the incremental acceptance of cruelty, the comfortable rationalization of complicity. Because the Holocaust was not committed by monsters, it was committed by human beings, people with families, with careers, with ordinary concerns and ordinary dreams, people who told themselves they were just following orders, just doing their jobs, just trying to survive. The mechanisms that enabled the Holocaust, propaganda that reconstructs moral reality, bureaucratic structures that diffuse responsibility, social pressure that makes conformity easier than resistance, dehumanization that transforms people into abstractions. These mechanisms still exist. They can be activated again by different ideologies in different contexts against different victims. This is why we study the Holocaust. Not to catalogue atrocities, not to indulge in historical horror, but to understand the specific, identifiable conditions that transform ordinary people into participants in genocide. To recognize the warning signs, to develop the psychological and social resistance necessary to say no when authority demands complicity in evil. The weight of history. In the decades since 1945, the world has seen other genocides: Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, Rwanda in 1994, Bosnia in the 1990s, Darfur in the 2000s, the Rohingya in Myanmar. Each of these atrocities demonstrates that the Holocaust was not unique in the sense of being unrepeatable. The psychological and social conditions that made it possible can recur. What varies is the specific ideology, the designated victims, the particular methods. But the underlying pattern remains recognizable. A society under stress, an authoritarian movement that offers simple answers to complex problems, the identification of a scapegoat group to blame for social ills, propaganda that dehumanizes that group, the gradual normalization of violence, and finally the systematic persecution that escalates into mass atrocity. The Holocaust remains the most thoroughly documented genocide in history. We have more evidence, more testimony, more forensic analysis than for any comparable crime. This documentation serves as both a historical record and a warning. It shows us in excruciating detail how a modern industrialized society can be transformed into a machine for mass violence. The Nazi regime kept meticulous records. They documented their victims, catalogued their property, recorded their transportation, and filed reports on their extermination. This bureaucratic obsession with documentation, intended to demonstrate efficiency, instead became the primary evidence of their crimes. The regime's own records condemned it. Survivor testimony adds another dimension to our understanding. The men, women, and children who survived the camps, the ghettos, the mass shootings, their accounts provide the human dimension that statistics cannot capture. They remind us that each number represents a person, that behind the incomprehensible totals were individuals with names, with histories, with loved ones who mourned them. And the testimony of perpetrators, given during post-war trials, in interviews, in private correspondence, reveals the psychological mechanisms that enabled ordinary people to commit atrocities. Their rationalizations, their self-justifications, their claims of having had no choice. These statements expose the mental gymnastics through which people maintain their self-image as decent individuals while participating in monstrous crimes. The question of uniqueness. Scholars have long debated whether the Holocaust should be understood as a unique event or as one example of a broader category of genocides. This question matters because it shapes how we think about prevention. If the Holocaust was unique, a singular product of specific historical circumstances that can never recur, then the lessons we draw from it are limited. We might conclude that it teaches us about a particular danger from a particular ideology in a particular time and place, but offers little guidance for recognizing or preventing other genocides. If, however, the Holocaust shares common features with other genocides, if it represents an extreme manifestation of psychological and social mechanisms that remain latent in human societies, then the lessons become universal. They become tools for recognizing the early warning signs of genocide and for understanding the conditions that must be prevented or disrupted to stop mass atrocity. The evidence suggests the latter interpretation. While the scale and bureaucratic efficiency of the Holocaust may be unprecedented, the underlying mechanisms are not unique to Nazi Germany or to anti-Semitism. Dehumanizing propaganda, authoritarian leadership, economic crisis exploited by extremists, the designation of scapegoat groups, the gradual normalization of violence, these patterns appear in other genocides as well. What makes the Holocaust particularly important for study is precisely this combination of extreme scale and extensive documentation. We can trace the process from the earliest manifestations of Hitler's ideology through the construction of the propaganda apparatus, the legal persecution of Jews, the establishment of ghettos, the invasion of Eastern Europe, and the work of mobile killing units, the construction of extermination camps, and finally, the frantic attempts to destroy evidence as the regime collapsed. We can see the entire trajectory. We can identify each step in the escalation. We can observe how propaganda prepared the ground, how legal measures normalized discrimination, how bureaucratic structures diffused responsibility, how ordinary people became complicit through action or inaction. This detailed understanding provides a template, not for predicting exactly how future genocides will unfold, but for recognizing the conditions and mechanisms that make them possible. It gives us the knowledge necessary to intervene earlier, to disrupt the process before it reaches the point of mass atrocity. The role of bystanders. One of the most painful aspects of studying the Holocaust is recognizing the role of bystanders, the millions of people who were neither victims nor perpetrators, but who witnessed persecution and chose inaction. Throughout occupied Europe, non-Jewish populations watched as their Jewish neighbors were marked with yellow stars, excluded from public life, herded into ghettos, and finally transported to unknown destinations. Most did nothing. Some actively collaborated, participating in roundups or looting the property of deported Jews. A small minority resisted, hiding Jews in their homes or helping them escape, often at great personal risk. Why did most people choose inaction? The reasons are complex and vary by individual circumstance. Fear played a role. Helping Jews was dangerous, often punishable by death. Self-interest was a factor. Jewish property was confiscated and redistributed, creating economic incentives for acquiescence. Anti-Semitism, which existed throughout Europe long before the Nazis, made some people indifferent to Jewish suffering or even supportive of persecution. But perhaps the most important factor was what psychologists call moral disengagement, the psychological process through which people convince themselves that inaction is acceptable. People told themselves that what was happening wasn't really their responsibility, that they couldn't make a difference anyway, that they had to prioritize their own family's safety, that the Jews must have done something to bring this upon themselves, that surely it wasn't as bad as it seemed. These rationalizations allowed ordinary people to witness atrocity without feeling compelled to act. They allowed bystanders to preserve their self-image as decent people while remaining complicit through inaction in a massive crime. This aspect of the Holocaust is particularly relevant today, because most of us, in most circumstances, are bystanders rather than direct participants in injustice. We witness suffering, inequality, persecution happening to others, often at a distance, and we face the same choice, to act or to rationalize our inaction. The Holocaust demonstrates that bystander inaction, multiplied across millions of people, creates the permissive environment in which genocide can occur. Perpetrators operate more freely when they face no social resistance. Victims are more completely isolated when they have no allies. The progression from discrimination to persecution to extermination becomes easier when each step is met with public indifference. Conversely, resistance need not be dramatic to be meaningful. During the Holocaust, the righteous among the nations, non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews, often began with small acts: hiding someone for a night, providing false papers, looking the other way when they could have reported someone. These small acts of courage, multiplied across thousands of individuals, saved tens of thousands of lives. The lesson is that we are not powerless. Even in circumstances where large-scale resistance seems impossible, individual choices matter. The choice to speak up rather than remain silent. The choice to help rather than look away. The choice to refuse complicity even when compliance would be easier and safer. These choices don't guarantee victory over injustice, but they deny that injustice the full cooperation it requires to function efficiently. They preserve the humanity of both the helper and the helped, and they create the possibility of resistance spreading, of others finding courage through example. The transmission of trauma. The Holocaust did not end in 1945. Its effects reverberate across generations. Survivors carried profound psychological trauma, what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though that term did not exist when they were liberated from the camps. Many struggled with nightmares, hypervigilance, survivor's guilt, and depression for the rest of their lives. Many found it impossible to speak about their experiences, carrying their trauma in silence. Research on Holocaust survivors and their descendants has revealed that trauma can be transmitted intergenerationally. Children of survivors, even those born after the war, often exhibit higher rates of anxiety, depression, and trauma-related symptoms. Some researchers have even identified potential epigenetic mechanisms through which parental trauma might influence the biology of offspring. This intergenerational transmission occurs through multiple pathways. Some survivors, unable to process their trauma, raised children in environments marked by hypervigilance, emotional distance, or overprotectiveness. Children internalized their parents' unspoken fears and anxieties. Some survivors told their stories in ways that transferred the weight of trauma to the next generation, making children feel responsible for carrying forward the memory of those who perished. The loss extends beyond individual families. The Holocaust destroyed entire communities. The vibrant Jewish cultures of Poland, Hungary, Lithuania, and elsewhere that had existed for centuries. Languages, traditions, religious practices, intellectual traditions, all of this was nearly extinguished. The Jewish diaspora today represents the scattered remnants of communities that were annihilated. This cultural genocide is one of the Holocaust's lasting injuries. It represents not just the loss of individual lives, but the destruction of entire ways of life, collective memories and cultural inheritances that can never be fully recovered. For the broader world, the Holocaust shattered certain comfortable assumptions about progress and civilization. Before the Holocaust, there was a widespread belief in European culture that modernity meant moral progress, that industrialization and education would naturally lead to more humane societies. The Holocaust demonstrated that the tools of modernity, bureaucracy, technology, industrial efficiency, could be turned toward genocide just as easily as toward human betterment. This realization fundamentally changed how we think about civilization. We can no longer assume that progress in science, technology, or economic development necessarily correlates with moral progress. We must recognize that the capacity for barbarism exists alongside and can be amplified by the instruments of modernity. Justice and accountability. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the Allied powers faced a question: what to do with the surviving Nazi leadership? The Nuremberg trials, held from 1945 to 1946, established important precedents in international law. 24 major Nazi officials were indicted on charges including crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against peace. 12 were sentenced to execution, 7 received prison terms, and 3 were acquitted. The trials were controversial. Some argued that they represented victor's justice, that the Allies were judging their defeated enemies by standards they did not always apply to themselves. Others argued that the defendants should have been summarily executed rather than given the dignity of a trial. But the decision to hold trials rather than executions established crucial principles. It affirmed that even in war, certain acts are criminal and individuals can be held accountable for them. It rejected the defense that "I was following orders" absolves someone of responsibility for atrocities. It established that heads of state and military officials are not immune from prosecution for crimes against humanity. These principles became foundational for international humanitarian law and eventually led to the establishment of the International Criminal Court. However, justice remained incomplete. Many perpetrators escaped prosecution entirely. Some fled to South America, the Middle East, or other regions where they lived out their lives in relative comfort. Others remained in Germany and Austria, their wartime roles concealed or minimized, their crimes unpunished. Adolf Eichmann's capture in 1960 and trial in Jerusalem in 1961 represented one of the most significant post-Nuremberg prosecutions. His trial was broadcast internationally and brought renewed attention to the Holocaust. His execution in 1962 was the only execution ever carried out by the State of Israel. But thousands of lower-level perpetrators were never prosecuted. The men who operated the gas chambers, who shot civilians in mass executions, who supervised slave labor, who conducted sadistic medical experiments, many of these individuals lived ordinary lives after the war, their crimes known only to themselves and their victims. This incomplete justice reflects a broader truth. After mass atrocity, complete accountability is impossible. There are too many perpetrators, too much bureaucratic diffusion of responsibility, too many who can claim they were merely following orders or merely doing paperwork. The machinery of genocide involves so many people at so many levels that holding everyone accountable becomes practically impossible. This reality underscores the importance of prevention. Once genocide occurs, justice will always be partial, incomplete, inadequate to the scale of the crime. The only real solution is to prevent genocide from occurring in the first place, to recognize the warning signs, to disrupt the conditions that make it possible to resist the early stages before they escalate into mass atrocity. The duty of memory never again became the rallying cry after the Holocaust. It represented a collective commitment to prevent future genocides, yet never again has proven to be an aspiration rather than a guarantee. Genocides have occurred repeatedly since 1945. Each time, the international community has responded with some combination of shock, denial, delayed intervention, and eventual acknowledgement that we failed to live up to our commitment. This pattern reveals an uncomfortable truth. Knowing about the Holocaust, understanding its mechanisms, even maintaining elaborate memorials and educational programs, none of this guarantees prevention. Knowledge alone is insufficient. What's required is the political will to act early, to recognize emerging dangers, and to intervene before escalation reaches the point of mass atrocity. Holocaust education serves multiple purposes. It preserves the memory of victims, honoring their lives and ensuring they are not forgotten. It provides testimony to the reality of the genocide, countering those who deny or minimize what occurred. It offers moral instruction, teaching younger generations about the consequences of hatred, prejudice, and indifference. But perhaps most importantly, it should serve as a warning system, teaching us to recognize the early stages of genocidal processes so we can intervene before they reach their terrible conclusion. The early warning signs are now well understood. Propaganda that dehumanizes a particular group, political movements that blame that group for social problems, legal measures that restrict the rights of the targeted group, economic measures that isolate them, violence that begins sporadically and is met with official indifference or tacit approval, and finally the systematic organization of that violence into state policy. When we see these patterns emerging, we have a choice. We can tell ourselves it's not our problem, that it's happening far away, that it's not as serious as it seems. That intervention would be too costly or complicated. Or we can recognize what we're seeing and act, through diplomatic pressure, through economic sanctions, through support for civil society groups resisting oppression, through accepting refugees, through international intervention when necessary. The duty of memory is not just to remember what happened. It's to learn from what happened in ways that change how we respond to injustice in the present. The human capacity for both evil and courage. If the Holocaust teaches us anything, it's that human nature contains contradictory potentials. We are capable of extraordinary evil, of participating in genocide, of rationalizing cruelty, of choosing self-interest over moral principle. The research on obedience, conformity, and moral disengagement makes this clear. Under certain conditions, most people will comply with terrible orders, will rationalize their complicity, will choose the path of least resistance, even when that path leads through atrocity. But we are also capable of extraordinary courage, the righteous among the nations who hid Jews at great personal risk, the resistance fighters who sabotaged Nazi operations knowing they would likely be captured and executed, the prisoners in concentration camps who shared their meager food with others, who maintained their humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it, the soldiers who liberated the camps and bore witness to what they found there, carrying that burden for the rest of their lives. Both capacities exist in human nature. Both can be activated by circumstance, by choice, by the examples set by others. The question facing each of us is, which capacity will we cultivate? Which will we encourage in others? Which will we allow to guide our actions when we face moral tests? Most of us will never face circumstances as extreme as those of the Holocaust, but we will face smaller moral tests throughout our lives. Moments when we witness injustice and must choose whether to speak up or remain silent. Moments when we see someone being scapegoated, dehumanized, or persecuted, and must decide whether to stand with them or look away. Moments when authority demands our compliance in something we recognize as wrong, and we must choose between obedience and resistance. The Holocaust demonstrates that these choices matter, that the aggregate of individual choices, to comply or resist, to participate or refuse, to speak up or remain silent, determines whether atrocity becomes possible or impossible. We cannot guarantee we would have been heroes if we had lived in Nazi Germany. Human nature is fallible, and circumstances matter more than we want to admit. But we can commit ourselves to recognizing the patterns that make genocide possible, to refusing complicity when we encounter injustice, to cultivating the moral courage necessary to resist, even when resistance is costly. This is the practical lesson of the Holocaust. Not that we must remember dates and numbers, though that matters. Not that we must maintain memorials, though that matters too. But that we must develop the psychological resistance, the moral clarity, and the political will necessary to say no when authority demands complicity in evil, to recognize dehumanization when we see it, to refuse to be bystanders when others are suffering, to remember that silence in the face of injustice is itself a choice, and a consequential one. The final accounting: Adolf Hitler died in a bunker in Berlin, his regime in ruins, his vision of a 1,000-year empire collapsing after just 12 years. The man who promised to reshape civilization according to his paranoid ideology, ended his life in a concrete tomb beneath a destroyed city, reduced to a partially burned corpse that was exhumed, examined, and ultimately destroyed. There is no mystery about his fate. The forensic evidence is conclusive. The historical record is clear. He orchestrated the greatest crime in human history, and when that crime led inevitably to his regime's destruction, he took his own life rather than face accountability. But the crime itself remains incomprehensible in its scale. 6 million Jews systematically eliminated, millions of others, Roma, disabled individuals, political dissidents, prisoners of war, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, also targeted for extermination. Entire communities erased, cultures destroyed, families annihilated. Behind these numbers are individuals, a child who never got to grow up, a parent who watched their family torn apart, an elderly person who survived decades of life only to perish in a gas chamber, a young person whose potential was never realized, a scholar whose work was lost, an artist whose creations were destroyed before they could be made. Each number represents a universe of experience, of relationships, of possibilities that were extinguished. The Holocaust stands as testimony to what human beings are capable of when hatred is systematized, when bureaucracy is turned toward destruction, when ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil. But it also stands as a warning. The mechanisms that enabled the Holocaust still exist. The psychological vulnerabilities it exploited remain part of human nature. The political and social conditions that made it possible can recur in different forms, in different contexts, against different victims. We cannot undo what happened. We cannot bring back those who were lost. We cannot fully comprehend the scale of suffering that occurred, but we can learn, we can remember, we can recognize the patterns, and we can commit ourselves to the proposition that it must never happen again, not through wishful thinking, but through vigilant attention to the conditions that make genocide possible and resolute commitment to disrupting those conditions whenever and wherever they emerge. This is the obligation the Holocaust places on all of us. Not guilt for crimes we did not commit, not collective punishment for being human, but responsibility for being vigilant, for being courageous, for refusing to be bystanders when others are suffering. The dead cannot speak, but we can speak for them by ensuring that the world they left behind, our world, becomes one in which such crimes are genuinely impossible because we have learned to recognize and resist the patterns that enable them. That is the only memorial that truly honors their memory. Not monuments of stone, though those have their place, but a living commitment to never allowing such atrocity to occur again, to building societies resistant to the propaganda that dehumanizes, to cultivating individuals capable of refusing orders they recognize as evil, to creating institutions that cannot be so easily turned toward genocide. The Holocaust happened, that is historical fact, documented beyond dispute. Adolf Hitler was responsible, that is certain. He died in Berlin in 1945, that is proven. But the larger questions, the questions about human nature, about the conditions that make genocide possible, about how we prevent it from happening again, those questions remain open. They require not just historical knowledge, but moral commitment. Not just memory, but action. Not just education, but the cultivation of courage. These are the questions we must carry forward. Because the Holocaust is not just history, It's a warning about what can happen when we fail to recognize the danger signs, when we choose comfort over courage, when we tell ourselves that injustice happening to others is not our responsibility. The victims of the Holocaust cannot be brought back, but we can ensure that their deaths were not meaningless by learning the lessons their suffering teaches us, by refusing to let the world forget, by committing ourselves to never again remaining silent in the face of dehumanization, persecution, and genocide. That commitment, lived out in our daily choices, in how we respond to injustice, in whether we find the courage to resist when resistance is necessary, is the only adequate response to the Holocaust. It demands everything from us: our attention, our moral clarity, our courage, our refusal to be bystanders, because in the end, the Holocaust teaches us that there are no innocent bystanders, only people who choose to act and people who choose complicity through inaction, only those who speak up and those who remain silent, only those who resist and those who comply. The choice is ours, and history is watching.